Welcome to my podcast. This is the Come Roll With Me podcast, and this is a podcast about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. We also talk about fitness, yoga, nutrition, and other health related topics as they relate to Jiu Jitsu. So, on today's episode, we're going to cover the book Jiu Jitsu University, and I've made some previous podcast episodes and they're not very good, but I hope to make today's episode of a higher quality. So, again, we're covering the book Jiu Jitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro, who's a 6-time world champion. And we're going to cover the white belt section of the book. Just useful information you should know. So we're going to go through what does it mean to survive, survivals as a foundation of jiu-jitsu, and survival positioning, and also survival in the white belt, and survival in the upper belt. We may not get to everything today, but that's the basic outline of what we're going to cover today. And yeah, let's get into it. But before we get into it, I just want to say, if you're thinking about training jiu-jitsu, you should definitely go into it because it's such a great sport. It's so great for your mental health, physical health, and you're going to learn self-defense. So let's get into it. The goal of the white belt, survival. Let's get into the book. What does it mean to survive? Everyone has fears, and every beginning jiu-jitsu practitioner at every academy will be accompanied by those fears when first stepping onto the mats. It may be the nightmare of claustrophobia, pain, or suffocation. In each situation, the student defeats these fears by facing them over and over again. At any moment, the student can tap to signal an end to the fight and start again and give it another try. Over time, he gradually liberates himself from the cycle of fear. This is a natural process of mental conditioning and it is the law for every student. Through this evolution, the grappler not only overcomes fear, but also the instinctive tendencies to fight and waste energy. In place of his fear, he develops confidence, fortitude, and peace in stressful times. In other words, he liberates himself from insecurity. Now, that's a lot of information to go over. So let's go back to the basic question. What does it mean to survive? Now, the problem in jiu-jitsu is that when you're starting off, you don't know anything. And when you don't know anything, it's really hard to know what to do, especially against people who are very experienced. And this could be a very frustrating feeling. So again, you don't know anything. You don't even know what to do. And the problem is it takes a very long time to learn what to do. Because after you learn what to do, you need to practice those techniques, which take a very long time to develop. So the solution to this problem is first learning how to survive. That's the solution to not knowing what to do. Just learning how to survive. When you learn these fundamentals, you learn the basics and surviving is the foundation you need in order to build upon all your other techniques. So the benefits of learning how to survive is that you can build your foundation of skills based on these survival techniques. And learning the survival techniques is actually a lot simpler than techniques you'll learn later on in your journey, which are more advanced. For example, you learn how to survive on the back. You learn how to survive when other people are on your back. You learn hand fighting. You learn common misconceptions. You learn surviving all fours. You can learn surviving the mount, surviving side control. And those are pretty much very basic techniques that you can learn. And then once you master these techniques, you can start building your foundation upwards and learn other techniques like escapes, guard control, achieving a dominant position, and of course submissions, which is the most fun part of jiu-jitsu, but which takes the longest to achieve, because you need to build a foundation which is similar to a pyramid in order to reach submissions, which is all the way on top of the pyramid. Now, back to the book. The second section is Survival as the Foundation of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It is important to realize that survival is the aspect that brings us closest to the founder of Jiu-Jitsu, Helio Gracie. Due to his smaller stature, Helio was forced to learn how to survive against much larger and much stronger opponents. Realizing that he would not be able to outmuscle these opponents, Helio instead looked for ways to survive. He was aware that it took much less energy to thwart his opponent's advances than it took to escape. His goal was simple. He may not win the fight, but he would not die. He would definitely survive. Being small in the world of fighting presents a lot of problems because you can't outmuscle your opponent. It's hard for a smaller person to knock out somebody who's larger than themselves. And when somebody is larger than you, they can overpower you, especially if you don't know fighting techniques. So the solution to that is to learn techniques which allows smaller people to defend themselves against larger people. And that's pretty much the foundation of jiu-jitsu. Teaching techniques where a smaller person can fight and actually beat larger people. And there are a lot of survival techniques that you can learn that fit this category. And this is the foundation of jiu-jitsu, surviving, and that's what Helio Gracie intended. Because when he first started his academy, when he first started developing this art, he was actually excluded from participating in the early days of his brother's academy because he was so small. And so he developed techniques in which anybody can use to defend themselves and survive. So the next section is survival positioning. I'm going to tell you something that goes against the current dogma of jiu-jitsu instruction. Survival is not based on escaping submissions. It is about putting yourself in a position where you do not need to use muscle to protect yourself. If it were based solely on escaping the submission, then how could we expect Helio Gracie at 130 pounds to be able to escape the tightest arm lock or the deepest choke? So again, Helio Gracie was able to prevent himself from being in situations where he was forced to escape. There's a famous quote by Albert Einstein where he says, "The best way to solve a problem is to avoid a problem. The best way to survive is by avoiding situations in which you're forced to escape." Survival is about assuming a position that impedes your opponent's offense, eliminating the chance of his submission. It is about changing the situation to one that favors the defensive player. In doing so, you force your opponent out of his comfort area. As a result, all of his actions become predictable because as he fights for offense from an uncomfortable position, there are only certain movements he can make. Survival is not about escaping. But it becomes easier to escape when you get to a stronger defensive position that forces your opponent into an awkward one. Technically speaking, you have to master every defensive aspect of a position. For example, hiding your elbows for protection, getting to your side to create the proper angle, and if necessary, preventing the crossface to inhibit being controlled. Now, being controlled is not necessarily when your opponent has a dominant position on you, but it could also mean when your opponent is constantly able to keep you in a neutral position as well. So if you allow your opponent to control you, then what that means is that the longer they're able to control you, the better situation they put themselves in order to put you in a submission. So what do you do about it? You need to learn how to control the fight yourself. You need to learn how to control your opponent as well. And as we spoke about before, learning to survive is the foundation of controlling your opponent. Because if your opponent is unable to submit you and for the whole round, that means you have power over them. That means no matter what they do, they cannot defeat you. So what this means is that now you can start learning how to control your opponent, putting them in full guard, putting them in half guard. And after you are able to control them, then you can move on to transitioning to more dominant positions. Now I'm gonna mention a pretty interesting story that Saulo Ribeiro, who's the author of this book, Jiu Jitsu University, mentions. He mentions it as a case study. And again, he's a 6-time world champion in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which means he's a pretty legendary figure. And if you know anything about Jiu Jitsu or the Jiu Jitsu world, you've probably heard of Saulo Ribeiro. So I'm going to get into what he says. So Saulo says, "The last time I trained with Helio Gracie was a truly memorable experience and is to the day the most important class I ever had on Jiu Jitsu. What struck me most was how Helio addressed me. He did not hold me in awe for my titles or championships. And what he said more than surprised me. He said, 'Son, You're strong, you're tough, you're a world champion, but I don't think you can beat me. At the time, I just looked at him sideways in disbelief. After all, how could a 90-year-old beat someone who is in his athletic prime? It was at this moment that I realized how he definitely put all the responsibility on me to defeat him. This is the key to Helio. He never says he will beat you, only that you will not beat him. This is important because he believes he will survive. His survival has nothing to do with perfect timing or strength. Instead, it has everything to do with mastering the defensive aspects of jiu-jitsu. He didn't say he would escape from my position or that he would do anything else. He said he would survive. The result of our training only validated that fact. Helio did survive, and I was not able to impose my game on him. Helio proved to me the importance of survivability and the defensive nature of jiu-jitsu. Furthermore, I took from him one of the greatest lessons ever. It is not enough to be able to defeat all of your challengers. To be able to tell any man that he cannot defeat you is to wield true power. So yeah, that's an amazing story. Even though Helio was not able to defeat Saulo, he was able to say that Saulo at least would not be able to defeat him either. And especially for self-defense, that's an important thing. If you can't win the fight, will you be able to at least survive the fight? So, to me, that was a very interesting story that a 90-year-old man was able to defend himself to survive against a 6-time world champion who was in his prime. So, that is the power of jiu-jitsu. And that is why it's so important for everybody to take up jiu-jitsu and to learn self-defense. Because you're going to be able to survive against people who are bigger than you, stronger than you, and faster than you. So that was today's podcast. I'm really appreciative if you've made it all the way through. My podcasts are going to continue to improve. We're going to continue covering topics in jiu-jitsu that are interesting, that are useful. I'm only a white belt, but I'm doing this podcast to educate myself, to educate other people. And my ultimate dream is to one day have my black belt in jiu-jitsu. And probably when I achieve that state, I'll have more credibility. But I want everybody to listen to this podcast with skepticism, with their own opinions. And if you have your own opinions, if you have disagreements, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you like this video, please consider liking it, and please consider subscribing to my channel. So again, if you're practicing jiu-jitsu, if you're in the sport, I think it's such a wonderful thing. It's so beneficial, and please represent the community with humility, pride, respect, and I would say humility is the most important thing to represent the community with. And this is a sport about uniting people together. So thank you very much for listening to my podcast, and I'll see you guys next time.